Hi, this is Dan Watanabe, and welcome to the April 2020 edition of What the Heck is Happening in Entertainment? Well, as you all know, the entertainment industry is always in a state of it's worse than it's ever been. I mean, you can go all the way back to the very beginning of filmmaking in 1896, or was it the early 20th century, when that experimental camera first jammed, and all of a sudden a bus turned into a hearse. And now, instead of being just merely documenting what the average person saw on a street scene, there was an opportunity to tell stories, or at least to create a special effect. And for those who were used to just parking a camera out on a street and filming it, this meant that things were about to change. And this has been true for every single major entertainment advance since that time. And more recently, we've seen how they've been coping with the threat of the YouTube generation and the loss of a lot of traditional legacy media type of business models. Right now, it seems like it really is worse than it's ever been, and it does seem like, well, the entertainment industry could be in heap big trouble. Yeah, and it's been here before. Trust me, when television first came in, or the video cassette recorder came in, or especially when sound came in, it was highly disruptive. But the entertainment industry was always able to survive based on the skill of the entrepreneur set, who would generally find a way to make money even when it looked like there was no way, when it looked downright hopeless. So I'm saying that now, for those of you who are entering the entertainment business, any time in the near future is going to be your golden moment. So let this be a great opportunity for you. Let's talk about what the state of the industry is first. In other words, get the bad news out of the way. Let's look at some of the big companies and how they've been handling the past fiscal year. Now, some of this might seem a little bit redundant, but the coronavirus has added a little bit of extra juice to bad things that were happening and made them accelerate. Let's start with the biggest monster of them all, and that's the Walt Disney Company. The Walt Disney Company has been through 2 managerial shifts in as many months. First of all, Robert Iger resigned his seat and was taken over by the other Bob, who's, okay, Dan, I just forgot the other Bob's last name, but he used to run the Parks division. He came in for a while, and now all of a sudden, Iger is back, ready to take over again. I feel that this is another example of the Walt Disney Company being so secure in their own appeal to Wall Street, in their own dominance over the industry, that they've set themselves up for a Pharaoh-like fail. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they have become absolutely divorced from their content. They are right now in a position where their management level, at least, seems to think that there's no way that they can fail, no matter what kind of cockamamie decisions they're making. Therefore, they make cockamamie decisions that are beyond belief to anyone who's a casual outsider. Now, on the one hand, you have a lot of people saying, yes, but in terms of their stock performance on Wall Street, they are still, well, beside the fact that they fell by 30% and more in the past couple of months, they're still very much beloved because they have such a large swatch of the industry under their control. That there's a distinct difference between something that looks good on paper and something that works well operationally. So I'm going to say that Bob Iger, who's always been a corporate man, he's never been entrepreneurial, has set himself up now to see the consequences of being completely focused on Wall Street and the finances and not at all on the operations. He sucks at operations. Let's just look at some of the divisions of Disney. One of them is ABC. Can we say that ABC has been in free fall for the better part of a decade? Secondarily, let's look at Pixar. Well, Pixar now has, I believe for the first time, a major flop on its hands. And that's simply because Pixar was forced to become more corporate. Never forget that right after Up came out, the Disney oligarchs led by Iger were very proud of saying, we're never going to make another movie like this because our toy manufacturer said, how the hell can we sell an old man and a Jap fat kid? I can say that, I'm Japanese. And that is exactly the language that was being used as to why Up, no matter how much it made at the box office, was a failure in terms of its marketing. Now, Nobody bothered to say, you know what? Pixar has a pretty unbroken record of doing great stuff. Don't think for a second that they're not onto something that is going to ultimately work. No. Instead, they immediately insisted on doing another Cars movie rather than some of the other more risky projects. And now we've seen the consequence of all of that, that your artist types, the ones who make a company like Pixar float, get demoralized. They feel like they're nothing but cogs in a wheel. And we all know that Disney has been called Mauschwitz and Dachau for decades. So it's not as if Iger is new at this. It kind of started back when Michael Eisner was in charge, and especially after the period when he brought Mike Ovitz in when they just bought ABC and then promptly almost screwed it over and killed the network. If it hadn't been for Millionaire, they would have been gone. Notice that Millionaire was a risk. Notice that Millionaire was going against industry logic. Notice that Millionaire saved their rear end. And I'm going to say that there's a little bit of a difference between the Disney of that time and the Disney of now. The Disney of that time understood that they had massively screwed up. And so they immediately did what most companies do when they've had a disaster. They immediately look to what works. And then they capitalized on it, perhaps too much, to the point where they destroyed Millionaire's franchise. But that's another story. What's happening today? Well, not only have they tanked ABC and Pixar, but look at the other asset that they bought. They spent $4 billion to buy Star Wars. And I know that there's certain people who feel that the sequel trilogy is in many ways better than the prequels or the original trilogy. But I'm going to say, as someone who's not necessarily a big Star Wars fan, that that's insane. You can't possibly say that with a straight face and expect people to not laugh at you behind your back. All you need to do is look at how the fandom has fallen apart for it. And it's one thing to accept that and say, oh, we made a mistake, let's retool. What did Disney do instead? Instead of trying to fix that problem, they chose to quintuple down on disaster. Instead of saying, we're having a problem with our core, they said, our core sucks. We want a new core. We're going to alienate our original core and accuse them of being miscreants. All right, that's called being very foolish business-wise. That's called being arrogant. That's called also being ignorant in your arrogance, or arrogant in your ignorance. Because how can you possibly say that going against your core audience is a good idea? That's cockamamie. But we've seen that throughout the entertainment industry, that's become an MO. The appreciation for a core audience, the appreciation for needing to nurture that, and in the fringes of nurturing that, being able to then subtly change your message on a slow and steady pace has been thrown away. All right, I know that there will be people who will argue with me and say, well, look at what CBS did with its Murderers Row back in the 70s when they replaced the Hee Haws and Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres with MASH and All in the Family and Mary Tyler Moore and Bob Newhart on the Carol Burnett Show. Well, yeah, look what night it was on. It was on Saturday night. It was on a night that was traditionally a bad night. So even if it failed, they still had their downside covered. And instead, it was a massive hit. It was a massive hit because it was delivering to an audience that which they had not seen. It was a huge risk. It was entrepreneurial. And it was led by people like Norman Lear and James L. Brooks and come on, Dan, the guy who was the showrunner on MASH. They all really had an idea on how to make this stuff happen. And moving even further in Disney's, I believe, malfeasance in office, let's look at what's been happening with their Marvel universe. Yes, the Avengers Endgame was the #1 movie of all time. And what are they following that up with? Look at the new comic books they have. Now remember, when they bought Marvel Comics, part of the reason was to create a new demand, a new franchise for new audiences that would be able to continue the series when, unfortunately, because of biology, their actors became too old to still play this kind of part into eternity. CGI improvements seen in The Irishman notwithstanding. look at what's been happening with the comic side. It has destroyed a lot of the independent comic book shops. Where do they think their fan base comes from? It comes from the comic book shops. Yes, maybe it's time to change the mode of delivery, but you don't change the mode of delivery or alienate the original mode of delivery until you have some hint on how to make things work moving into the future. So now we have the potential of Marvel being in trouble. And what's the sign of that? Look at what they're talking about as their newest Marvel movies. It's, again, an alienation of their core audience. I don't understand why there's not already been a revolt among the shareholders who certainly see that Iger is fulfilling his own agenda, not the agenda of what is going to ultimately have the Disney empire make money. I believe we're not only seeing the failure of the Star Wars attractions at the Disney parks, but the fact that the parks are now closed and thereby costing Disney approximately $30 million in revenue a day, that a lot of the other problems with Iger's regime are coming to the fore, that people are starting to notice some of the other managerial, shall we say, interesting choices that he has made. Now, again, in Iger's favor, being someone who is a Wall Street darling, he looked at the fact that George Lucas had the rights to his original trilogy characters, as well as the prequels. So that meant that if Disney wanted to put those characters in the park attractions, they would need to pay him a royalty. They did not want to do that because the royalty was very expensive. George Lucas is not a stupid man after all. So instead, they tried to come up with this whole new thing that the Kylo and the Rey characters are actually far more popular than the original trilogy characters. Where that cockamamie idea came from, I have no idea. And the fact that they felt that by going on Twitter or the social media or through their publicists that they could somehow convince the public that what wasn't true was, is an idea of just how detached from reality a lot of management is. They're not paying attention to their actual P&L statements. They're paying attention to their size, to their growth. We all remember what happened the last time this happened, and we had a market crash. So this is not a very good way of doing business. There is no such thing as a new paradigm. Whenever you hear someone talk about a new paradigm where things don't need to be done the old way, it might be true, but don't buy it right away. You need to see some evidence that this has indeed happened. And in the case of what's going on at Disney and in general in Hollywood at large, this is a really big problem. Now, let's move from Disney to talk about another less consequential disaster that's happening, but it's nonetheless illustrative. Let's look at what's happening over at Paramount. Now, Paramount truly has been on the verge of becoming a mini-major for a long time. And a big part of that, I believe, has to deal with the rule of the Redstones, who looked at Paramount almost as if it was a private company where kind of commingling assets isn't necessarily a big deal. The company was split, everyone made money, and now they decided to bring the company back together. Unfortunately, there were two bad pieces of timing that have absolutely caused them angina. The first of these is that their financial situation was so tenuous that they had to sell the CBS lot. Now, I know that people will say, oh, no, that was a wise move because they're not really in the business of real estate and there's certainly enough space that they can pick up. No. Perception is often much more important than fact. And when you have a prized piece of land like that and then you sell it, it doesn't matter what the spin is. Most people who are the least bit savvy know that you are not going to give up that kind of trophy property unless you are desperate. And it doesn't matter how much they made from that, because they certainly did sell it at top of market. The bottom line is that in the same way, when William Morris Agency was before it was bought out by Endeavor, and they sold their El Camino property, everyone knew that they were doomed. Didn't matter how much legacy it had, didn't matter how much cash they had in reserves. They had definitely blown through it. Otherwise, they would never give up something that they had controlled since the 30s. And sure enough, they were bought by Endeavor almost as if they were just going for the name. They weren't necessarily even going for their talent because most of them left. And in something like talent management, what are your real hard assets? You don't have any. They walk out the door every night. So surely that was almost like they spent Endeavor spent a lot of money for the name in order to give it some gravitas, at least to international potential investors in the future. And that will be another story coming up very shortly. So by Paramount doing that, they set the world on notice that there's something that's probably not going well, even though the remerger between CBS and the Paramount Viacom side looked good on paper. Well, in a strategic error, which I don't blame them for, they held off doing their big announcement of the merger being completed until after the release of the most recent Terminator movie because they felt that that was going to be a hit. Surprise, it wasn't. Why? Because once again, they decided that they were going to expand the audience. They were going to say F you to their core fans, and they were going to come up with an entirely different franchise that would represent diversity and women. There's nothing wrong with diversity or female leads. They have been successful since time immemorial within the industry. Doubt me? How about the diversity part? What was one of the most important early talkie movies? Why, it was Hallelujah, and Hallelujah was about the plight of African Americans. It was a huge hit among white audiences, and I know that that's toxic to say, but hey, it's the truth, and oh well. But in the case of this, you're taking something that is highly male-oriented. Its secondary audience is female. The second Terminator crossed over beautifully and became a 4-quadrant movie, meaning it appealed to both older and younger males and females. Hollywood always talks about wanting to make a 4-quadrant movie. They actually don't exist. You have to start with your primary quadrant, or maybe 2 quadrants. Maybe it's all males. Maybe it's all young people, or older people. But you have to start with your strength. Not trying to say we're going to ignore our strength and just assume they'll show up. Well, we all know what happened with the Terminator movie, so they ended up having to go into that stockholder meeting with a double whammy of bad news. We're going to be saved by this franchise has just bombed, and we sold our trophy property. Do you think that stockholder meeting was very friendly? I'm going to say no. So Paramount is really in a bad state. Now, let's look at another studio that's kind of not necessarily in big danger right now because they're still coming out of their merger. So let's see where the bodies land, if you will. But I'm going to say that AT&T is going to regret the purchase of Warner Brothers with that same amount of regret that Coca-Cola felt when they bought Columbia TriStar. Whenever you have an outside entity that has been very good at being a disciplined corporation and they try to tame Hollywood, they always end up with an unbelievable disaster. And I believe that's what's going to happen. And you could tell that the Warner Brothers executives were doing everything to cover up the truth. And in fact, in the process of trying to cover up the truth, knowing that AT&T was obsessed with the financials, they made a couple of strategic errors that have come back to absolutely bite them. The chief of these is, of course, what they did with Game of Thrones. Now, with Game of Thrones, there was a problem because the show was old. The show was riddled with debt. Even though it was the #1 show in terms of television, and in fact, in terms of pretty much a big chunk of the history of the entire industry, it was still something that was highly risky. And it represented a big hemorrhage of cash that was starting to lose some of its audience. So they felt they needed to wrap it up, especially with AT&T buying them and looking at how much that show was in terms of cost overruns because it wasn't managed properly. Creatively being mismanaged doesn't necessarily impact the quality of the work, but it certainly doesn't make it any easier. And so the decision was that they were going to end the show this year, come hell or high water. And the actual ending of it is not necessarily a bad ending. Why did audiences hate it? because the ending wasn't paced properly. After pacing something as if it was a miniseries for 8 years, and then coming to your last season and acting as if you're compacting War and Peace into a 2.5 hour movie is a mistake. You are now not giving the fans what they're used to. And they don't care what your financials are. They don't care that Benioff and Weiss are thinking of leaving to run the next Star Wars movie. They don't care about any of that stuff. They want to see a good show. They want to get those knockoffs that they were getting for the past near decade. And it's almost as if the executives who were running the HBO portion had forgotten the lesson. Okay, it was a while ago, but the ending of Sopranos was a really important lesson in what not to do with a piece of intellectual property. The ambiguous ending of the original series of Sopranos ended any thought of a feature film follow-up. And of course now Gandolfini's dead, so it's not as if it could happen anyway. And it's been, nearly 20 years before they could even think of launching a sequel. The original ending of The Sopranos, as much as we can look at it today and say, well, it actually was pretty clever because it's clear that the guy gets popped at that moment because that's the end of his life. It's in the middle and it's unexpected of everything. No, you need the damn gunshot. At least that would have given some sort of closure. By doing that, the chances of reruns for The Sopranos were greatly curtailed. By making that same mistake with Game of Thrones, they have done the exact same thing. And to add insult to injury, although this part probably won't be long lasting, you had the problem with Benioff and Weiss going to a convention and shooting their mouths off about how they didn't even know why they were hired for this. The first thing they did was a disaster, and it's only because they had already made some foreign deals that they were given the green light. And they said something to George Mitchell that made him happy, so they were the right people. Well, no. The real fact of why they were given that, the real fact that these couple of really newbies into the industry were given this golden chance is because Benioff's father was the president of Goldman Sachs. You think that had anything to do with the fact that they were able to get certain financial deals in place? I do. And what did Benioff and Weiss do with their success? They acted like arrogant Beverly Hills kids always do. It's like, okay, well, I'm certainly special and spectacular, and I've made this big hit, and which I'm not taking away from them. And now it's time for me to move on to bigger and better things, and screw you. So rather than HBO saying, you know what, I don't care how much it costs, we need to give this ending enough time to breathe so it doesn't feel rushed, so it doesn't feel like a betrayal of everything that had come before it. So they didn't. They insisted they had to wrap it up. So now they're stuck with a dead asset. And they were so stuck with a dead asset, they came up with that ridiculous stunt of having that Starbucks cup in the middle of a shot. We know that that's not possible, that somebody didn't catch that before. I don't care. If you worked in post, you know that there's no way that would have gone through to air. That was deliberately put there because by the time that episode aired, people were already talking about how sucky the season was and they needed to distract from that particular truth. And it minorly worked, but the last episode was still a problem and they never recovered from it. So now you have a dead asset. The other problem that Warner Brothers had is they had a shock hit with Joker. It's actually not a shock hit. It delivered an audience to exactly what the demographics were, and it delivered it the way that the audience wanted it. So, of course it was going to be a hit. Plus, it had a sensational lead performance. There was no way that wasn't going to work. So what did they do with that? They completely unlearned the lesson that Joker taught them, and they messed up the release of Birds of Prey. And again, who's your audience? Always start with who's your audience. You must deliver to your core, and they didn't. So, moving forward, we can look at certain of the big companies that are actually doing okay. One of them is NBC Universal, Comcast. Now, I'm not saying that they haven't had certain struggles. I'm not saying that they're not somewhat economically challenged. But overall, the people who were in Comcast, and I was wrong about this when they originally did the deal. I thought it was a joke because Comcast had to get some money from GE in order to have the funds to make that happen. They even had to do that Jay Leno stunt where he was going to do a variety show. I mean, everybody knew that was a sham. And of course it was. They needed him to do that so that they wouldn't have a development season. They wouldn't have an expensive show they had to do that could fail. They knew that that show would probably not work, and it didn't matter because it was so cheap relative to the amount of money they would save. That allowed that merger to go through. And the beauty of Comcast is they came from the world of cable. So they understood audience. They understood who their audiences were. They understood how to service that audience. And note what they've done with Jason Blum. Jason Blum, when he first went inside, there was some fear that he was going to start making these big, overblown movies, and he never did. And he stayed with his lower budgets, so he was able to innovate. And look at what's happened because of that. Look at how many careers he has started because he never went over budget. He stayed within that narrow confine. Okay, yeah, The Hunt was a disaster, but that's walk-around money compared to the vast profit they've made in the past, and that wasn't a mistake of timing. Every bit as much so as when they did the Challenger movie. When the kids get on the Challenger, they couldn't release it because the Challenger blew up. So there are certain times when something happens in the world that impacts what you have made as a film, and that just happened to be a victim of bad timing. So Comcast has a big library. It has what appears to be an audience-centric or a buyer-centric business plan overall. And so I see them as being fairly stable. A company that I thought was on the tenterhooks but actually isn't is Sony. And the reason they're not is because, yes, during the Amy Pascal reign of feature films, there were a lot of mistakes made. But Sony had a wide berth of protection in the same way actually Disney did, although again, they kind of squandered a bit, because they have such strength in television, in game shows, in formats, and because they're run by a Japanese management company, which has its pluses and minuses. I'm Japanese, I can say that. It's nonetheless one that they've gotten it to work, that Sony Pictures has not fallen under the same problem that Sony Electronics has in Japan because of the post-Morita Akio management. So I do think that because of their success in television and their deep library that has not been overexploited, and their lack of overspending, I think that they're actually in a sweet spot. But the industry is facing other threats. Some of them have been fortunately ameliorated recently. The biggest of these is the Writers Guild strike, which was a looming threat that was in the background. And the reason it was a looming threat and hadn't been solved is because there were two competing factions. One of them is the Endeavor side. The big five agencies had wanted to move not only into packaging, which they've been doing for 25 years. So when the Writers Guild tried to say, okay, we got to get rid of this packaging thing, it's like, stop, the horse has already left the barn. You can't back that out anymore. It'd be almost impossible. However, the big agencies were planning to do their own productions, which flied in the face of the MCA decrees of the 1960s, when Lew Wasserman, head of MCA at the time, who just bought Universal, let it be known that he wanted to do his own pictures now that he owned the studio. And he was made by Congress to make a choice. Either you do film production or you do management. You cannot do both. And that's why agents are franchised right now. And for years, they've tried to make the case for why they should make films. And every time they've come across the MCA decree that's blocked them. I don't know what gave Endeavor the hubris, shall we say, to plan on doing an IPO where they casually mentioned that they were hoping to do pictures. The SEC takes one look at that and goes, what are you guys talking about? You can't do this. This violates the law. And, they acted stupid. And it's like, you bet you look stupid. How can these high-priced Beverly Hills lawyers have gone through all of the paperwork that's necessary for an IPO and no one said, we got this MCA decree. How are we going to get around that? Well, they tried their usual legal sleight of hand and it failed. So that part's gone away. That allowed some of the smaller agencies in the big group, like Paradigm, to finally sign off with the Writers Guild. So that strike probably is not going to happen. That's good news, because that also means that eventually everyone else will sign on. It's a favored nations type thing. And at least for now, the big agencies aren't going to be able to do a repeat of what they did in the 80s. Okay, a little bit of a flashback here. During the 80s, Mike Ovitz, who was at that time in charge of CAA, which was the biggest of the talent agencies, creative artists, used to tell people that we have our henchmen walking up and down Wilshire Boulevard, and if you cross us, we can get you. And he meant it. And that was during the era when a lot of the agencies were first really experiencing the flush of money that could be made from having an attractive package. In fact, there was an infamous case where there was a script called Ticking Man that was delivered to every single production company with an alarm clock on it that went tick, 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 that at 2 hours they had to have their offer on the table, which meant no one could read it. You just had to make an offer based on the package. It was a blind offer. And of course, it ended up being bought and in an auction, and a lot of money was put on the table. The movie was never made because it wasn't necessarily all that good a script. So eventually, that type of packaging caused all sorts of the little independent production companies, such as Vestron and Hemdale and Force 10 and Kings Road and Orion, to go out of business because they were spending too much money. There's other reasons too, but I won't go into that. It's blood under the bridge. But you would have thought that with a lot of the older executives having been around during that period, that they wouldn't have tried to do the exact same thing again, where they wouldn't try to just continually force packages on people that weren't viable. And that's the problem that I see with the industry today, is that in addition to not being content focused and being overly deal focused, they're package focused, which means that you will have people buy a package. And that the problem with a package is that means it's usually coming from only one agency or a combination of agencies, but you are stuck with the limited talent that's within that pool. And when you're stuck with the limited talent that's within that pool, you can't necessarily have the ideal director with the ideal cinematographer, with the ideal production designer. I'm only talking below the line. I'm not even talking about, okay, directors above the line, but I'm not even talking about the stars or the producer. I'm talking about the craftspeople who absolutely need to be able to work together well. And when you have that kind of package, you can't necessarily make that happen. So you're crippling your creative team by not having them have the most compatible talents working together at the same time. This is a big issue when you have agencies forcing these deals. I've now given a bunch of bad news. Let's talk about the good news. The good news has some bad portions to it, but it's nonetheless good news. The good news is that, as always, when the industry is going through this type of an upheaval, there's nothing but opportunity for people who are looking to break into it now. Why? I hate to say this, because you are hopefully younger and easy to be exploited. What do I mean by exploited? They're not going to pay you what you might be paid if you were being paid exactly for your talent. However, what you're doing is you're being groomed into knowing how the industry operates. And in the process of that, you'll go from being underpaid to being overpaid pretty quickly. This is the opportunity that's out there again. The industry has been fighting against independent content. And it's not only on YouTube, where you're seeing the big corporations, which are facing a lot of stress, trying to get rid of the competition by getting them demonetized and pushed out. That really only works for a short amount of time. If you are in the process of a downward spiral, you cannot reverse it by trying to block the competitive edge. The competitive edge, especially in an industry like entertainment, cannot be held down. Trust me, the audiences that CNN and Fox and MSNBC have been able to get on YouTube by YouTube willingly giving them prime space and putting them in the top of recommended piles and trying to demonetize their larger creators in the hope that they get rid of them. These people aren't going to go away. There's too many of them, and they're too talented, and they're too good at what they do, and they've been breaking new talent. The older industry has not been active in searching out new talent. Part of this goes back to the talent agencies. There used to be a combination of boutiques, which are the small, pretty much one or two person offices, and mid-sizes, which had a nice roster of talent but weren't overly large, and they couldn't necessarily do a complete package. And then your big ones, which handled the big talent. Well, they've gotten rid of that entire middle class of agencies. So the journeyman part of anybody's career is being forestalled because you're either with a small player, in which case you really have to be extraordinary to break through the fog, or you have to be sleeping with the right people. No, I didn't really say that. Or you have to be brought into a big agency. But there's a danger if you're fairly new in the industry and you get brought into a big agency. More likely than not, and it's going to be bad news for a lot of you, more likely than not, you're actually being brought in so you stop being competitive to whoever their big talent is. That doesn't mean you won't get work, but all of a sudden you're up for Lifetime movies and not big feature films. It's just the way that game is played. You have to protect the star. And look at what's happened. We now have stars who are getting very old, and they're not being replaced properly by actors and writers and directors who are younger. So this bad period we're in right now is going to force a realignment because nobody who has a high-paying job wants to lose it. And at a certain point, you have to say, okay, the way we were doing business isn't working anymore, and we're either going to have to adapt to this or we're going to die. And the only way to do that is to bring in new blood, to bring in new people who have a different kind of a voice, who have a different kind of a passion. And a lot of that passion is not based on money. Most people who get into entertainment don't do it because of the money. They're doing it because they have an emotional need to be in this industry, to be creative, to perhaps save the life of someone else the way they themselves were saved. Yes, I'm being autobiographical here. Yes, watching too many movies and TV shows definitely stopped me from becoming a sociopath, or maybe I am a sociopath, but that's another story. Anyway, the industry thrives on that new talent, and a lot of that new talent makes itself known because they can create a hit out of very little in terms of resources. They have the moxie, they have the vision, they have the interpersonal drive, not for the paycheck, but for the creativeness. And that is the excitement that will bring audiences back in a big way. Not this kind of, oh, well, we have a big Twitter following, so that means we're going to be a hit. No, it's actually appealing to who your core is. I also think that the other thing you're going to see happen is regionalization once again. For too long, the industry has been focused on how well a picture performs in Europe. The big lesson I learned when I was working in distribution is that unless your company is exclusively based on the foreign market, if you are looking at the U.S. as your actual home base and the real center of your business, you better deliver to your home market first. And if you're finding that your product is selling better overseas than it's selling at home, you're setting yourself up for a disaster. Why? Because tastes are fickle. If the foreign market suddenly doesn't like your genre or your style of movie, you get dropped. Whereas in the U.S., if you have a strong audience appeal, even if it's for a more regional film or an ethnocentric film that won't work overseas but is a low enough budget to where it can make a nice profit in the U.S., that's how it should be. All film renaissances have been based on the big studios having a disaster, whether it be self-imposed by trying to do too many musicals, whether it be because a new technology invades like television, which of course increased box office eventually. It was a moment of disruption, but then it all worked out. Or home video, any of these things. And so for those of you who are younger, this is your golden time. Do not be disheartened when someone says it's worse than it's ever been. That just means it's a bigger opportunity for you. I know this has been long, but I felt I needed to give the context before I gave the good news. Please keep up with your entrepreneurial side. Please keep up with what you want to see, not what you feel the market wants to buy. That always changes. And later on, we'll talk about how you can talk about your project perhaps a little bit in a salesman's type way, where without changing your project, you can reframe it for what it is and get people interested in it, even though it's not what they might have been thinking they wanted to buy. After all, if the movie Being John Malkovich could be made and have a nice return on investment, anything can work. Thank you very much.